When a painfully shy 13-year-old girl from a forgotten coastal town in northern England walked onto one of the biggest television stages in the world in 2018, she was already trembling before a single note had been sung. The audience expected a quiet audition that would fade into the background of the evening's broadcast. What happened instead was a moment so explosive, so raw, that it rewrote the rules of what a child performer could be. Within seconds, a girl who had spent her entire school life trying to become invisible became the most talked about person on the planet. But behind the viral clips, the golden confetti, and the tears of joy, a much darker machine was already turning. Her name is Courtney Hadwin, and her story is not simply about talent, it is about what happens when extraordinary ability collides with a system that was never designed to protect the human being carrying it. To understand Courtney, you have to leave the bright lights of the audition room and travel back to Hartlepool, a town where the North Sea wind carries a kind of quiet loneliness that gets into your bones. She wasn't the girl people noticed. According to early interviews and accounts from those who knew her, she was so deeply introverted that walking through a crowded school corridor felt like wading through chest-high water. Raising her hand in class was unthinkable. Speaking to someone new was a genuine, physical challenge. Teachers described her as the child at the back of the room who could go an entire day without uttering more than a handful of words. Social anxiety wasn't a phase for Courtney, it was the architecture of her daily existence, a constant background hum of fear that made the ordinary world feel hostile and overwhelming. Yet inside that same small, quiet frame lived a voice that had no business coming from a child. When she was alone, when the pressure of being seen was removed, music poured out of her like a dam breaking. Her parents noticed it early, a sound that seemed to come from another era entirely, something raw and untamed that rattled the walls and left them speechless. There was a wild, almost feral energy when she performed in the safety of her own home, a completely different human being who could command a room even when the only audience was the furniture. This is the cruel paradox that sits at the heart of Courtney's story. She possessed a gift that demanded to be shared, but she existed inside a nervous system that was wired to reject attention. She was a born performer trapped in a person who desperately did not want to be seen. Her parents understood both sides of this equation. They saw the magic in their daughter's voice, but they also witnessed the daily battle with anxiety that left her exhausted. They knew that putting that voice into the world would come with a price their child might not be emotionally equipped to pay. The question that lingered in those early years was as simple as it was terrifying. What kind of pressure would crush a girl this shy once the spotlight found her? They had no way of knowing that they were about to receive an answer none of them were prepared for. The America's Got Talent audition almost didn't happen. This is a detail lost in the celebration. According to sources close to the family, Courtney had to be persuaded repeatedly before she agreed to step into that audition room. The very idea of standing in front of a live crowd, with millions more watching at home, filled her with a dread that went far beyond ordinary stage fright. It was the kind of fear that makes your hands shake and your throat close. But someone convinced her, perhaps a family member who believed the world needed to hear what she could do, perhaps a fleeting moment of courage that she herself couldn't explain. Whatever the reason, in 2018, Courtney Hadwin walked onto that stage with a look of pure, undisguised terror. The moment she appeared, the judges saw exactly what the audience saw, a small, fragile-looking teenager with trembling fingers and an uncertain gaze. They offered her the polite, slightly detached encouragement given to hundreds of contestants before her. No one in that room expected anything remarkable. Then the music started, and the girl who had spent years hiding in the back of classrooms opened her mouth. What came out was not a performance. It was an exorcism. The voice was impossibly large, drenched in a soul and grit that seemed to belong to a veteran of decades, not a 13-year-old from a seaside town. It was the sound of every suppressed word, every swallowed emotion, every moment of invisible pain finally being given permission to exist. Howie Mandel slammed the golden buzzer. The room erupted. In the space of a single song, Courtney Hadwin had gone from invisible to immortal. Within 48 hours, the clip had accumulated tens of millions of views. News outlets across continents were running features. Comment sections and forums exploded with praise, analysis, and speculation. The quiet girl who struggled to speak up in class was now being dissected by the entire world. But what almost nobody witnessed, what the cameras were not designed to capture, was the chaos that erupted backstage the moment the golden confetti settled. The sudden surge of microphones, the adult strangers demanding interviews, the unfamiliar faces asking her how it felt when her entire nervous system was still screaming from the shock of what had just occurred. In that instant, her life split into a before and an after, and there was no door leading back. Overnight fame is a violence dressed in celebration. For an adult with a fully formed identity and years of emotional tools, it is disorienting. For a 13-year-old with crippling social anxiety, it was an unrelenting assault on every protective boundary she had ever built. Media requests flooded in from every direction. Talk shows, magazine profiles, brand partnerships. Management decisions were being made around boardroom tables by people who had never asked her what she actually wanted. Label meetings materialized, with executives discussing contracts and marketing strategies while she sat silently, a product being packaged while still trying to understand what had happened to her life. She was being asked to turn on the electric, untamed performer on command, in unfamiliar cities, surrounded by adults who treated her talent as a resource to be mined. And all the while, the real Courtney, the one who still shook when someone looked at her too long, was being quietly erased. Following her America's Got Talent run, Courtney signed with a major label. That signature placed her inside a machine that was calibrated for adults, not for teenagers still figuring out who they were. According to reports, the recording and promotional process were relentless. There were disagreements about musical direction, expectations that dismissed her own instincts, and a calendar packed with obligations that ignored the simple truth that she was still a child. She was supposed to be a student, a girl navigating homework and friendships, not an international recording artist running on a schedule designed by profit margins. Sources close to her journey have described the transition as chaotic, disorienting, and deeply destabilizing. She was trying to be everything at once: the brand, the performer, the grateful prodigy, the investment that needed to pay off. Something inside her was always going to break. There is an uncomfortable question the entertainment industry rarely answers honestly. When a child signs a contract, who is in the room whose sole job is to protect that child's emotional and psychological safety? Not their marketability, not their earning potential, but their actual human well-being. The incentives are tragically misaligned. Courtney was burning out, and the machine around her didn't pause. It simply expected her to keep producing. Those who followed her closely began to notice the silences. Gaps appeared in her online presence. Releases were delayed with vague explanations. Interviews became carefully guarded, each word chosen with the precision of someone who had learned that openness came with consequences. These silences were not random. They were the sound of a young person slowly coming apart while the world, distracted by the next viral moment, began to look away. The internet's attention, always hungry and always temporary, drifted to the next extraordinary child, the next golden buzzer, the next feel-good story. And Courtney Hadwin, once the brightest object in the cultural sky, seemed to vanish. But that disappearance was not a failure. It was, in its own painful way, the beginning of something more honest. Behind the closed doors, away from the cameras and the expectations, a slightly older Courtney was starting to understand what had happened to her. She was no longer the terrified 13-year-old who didn't know how to say no. She was developing her own boundaries, her own opinions, and her own quiet fury at a system that had treated her as a commodity. The silence was not emptiness, it was a period of deep personal reckoning, a teenager trying to untangle who she actually was from who the world had told her she should be. This part of the story matters because it reframes everything we call a flop era or a failed career. The silence of a young artist is too often read as a career death when, in truth, it might be the first time that person has ever been allowed to breathe. Courtney was learning how to exist without performing. She was grappling with the guilt of disappointing millions while desperately needing to save herself. She was facing the loneliness of being known by the entire world and understood by almost nobody. And she was doing all of this while trying to be a normal teenager, someone who could form friendships, make mistakes, and grow up without every moment being dissected by strangers. What followed that quiet period was not a triumphant, polished comeback engineered by the same machine that had once consumed her. It was something far more delicate and far more real. Courtney began to release music again, but this time it was shaped by her own hands and her own voice. Not the voice the label had demanded, not the persona the audience expected, but the actual, imperfect, searching voice of a young woman reclaiming ownership of her gift. The songs carried fragments of her actual personality. The statements she made started to hint, carefully, at what the previous years had cost her. There was visible growth, and there was healing, but it was the kind of healing that doesn't tidy itself up for public consumption. And yet the story refuses to tie itself into a neat, comforting bow, because the most important part of it is not about Courtney Hadwin alone. It is about the system that continues to cycle through extraordinary young people, extracting everything it can while the spotlight is hot, and then discarding them the moment the novelty fades or the child dares to ask for autonomy. This pattern is not a bug, it is the design. Right now, as these words are being written, there are other 13-year-olds sitting in rooms full of adults who are making decisions about their careers without ever genuinely considering their emotional safety. They are learning, as Courtney learned, that being talented and being treated with real kindness are two completely different things. Her story is heartbreaking not because she failed. It is heartbreaking because she succeeded. She had the impossible talent. She got the break that millions dream of. She went viral, she got signed, she did everything she was told to do, and the world was still not gentle with her. The question that remains after the cameras turn off is not simply what happened to Courtney Hadwin. We know what happened. We watched it unfold. The real question is how many more children are right now being fed into the same machinery, and what we are willing to accept as normal when it comes to young people and fame. Her story does not end here, but maybe its most honest resolution lies not in what becomes of one girl, but in whether we ever learn to stop mistaking a child's brilliance for a permission to break them.